Okay, let's continue on where we left off last time. We were talking about these new territories out past the colonies, now states, and what will happen to them. Okay, so let's take a little more look at that. This is just a general overview of the territories at the time. You can see 1783 Treaty of Paris divided North America into these territories belonging to the United States now, several European countries. So to the north there, you've got the British, you've got the French, you've got the Spanish, and so forth. One of the things it did not do was address anything to do with Native Americans, Indians, Indian lands. And so this is going to be a continuing problem. So for the United States, they have a lot of territory there in blue, but a bunch of it is on the other side now of the mountains. And what's going to happen with that? You can see here is just one example of what we call about the overreach or the overbearing states. Connecticut comes in and takes a chunk of Pennsylvania, what would become Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all the way to the Mississippi River. They eventually have to cede that in 1786. And the Connecticut Western Reserve is not ceded until 1800. And so what they're going to do with this, you can see it makes up parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. That's the Northwest Territory, 1787, as part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They were going to divide it into 3 to 5 states. And each would be eligible for statehood once it reached 60,000 settlers. There was to be religious freedom here. That is, there was not going to be sort of a state religion. And there's going to be the right of trial by jury, free access to all major rivers of the region. And this is an important point. Slavery is banned north of the Ohio River. So in these territories, there's never slavery. They divide things into townships. As you can see there, a township is 6 by 6 miles square. 6 miles by 6 miles square. And they have plots or sections that are 1 square mile or 640 acres. Okay. So this is the Northwest Ordinance. By the way, my grandfather in probably the 1920s, so almost 100 years ago now, purchased a square mile, a section, 640 acres in Indiana, just south of Lake Michigan there. And since he died very young, my grandmother had to sell the farm, basically. She ended up with 80 acres, and my great aunt, her sister, with 40. So that's a section. It's sometimes called a section or a square mile. All right, so this is very organized, very systematic. Everything divided. They brought out surveyors, and they set it up in townships, all in the coordinates. You know, if you go and say in Indiana and you're looking for county roads and things up there where it's nice and flat, everything is very straight. Everything is going north, south, east, west, and that was all set out by surveyors very early on. Well, one of the problems, of course, they have here is one with foreign relations. Remember, the British, the Spanish have territory, but since we have a weak federal government, there's really the borders are not secure. And what are we going to do with those borders? Well, we don't have anyone to negotiate it. And so different groups take advantage of this weakness. Certainly the British will, the Spanish will, and another group you might not normally think about, and that's pirates. Pirates. As we already mentioned, debt is one of the immediate problems. The government had to repay the bonds which it had sold to finance the Revolutionary War. There were salaries owed to soldiers that had not been paid, and this angered them. There were farmers who became outraged or enraged because of inflation. And, of course, this is creating problems in their life. This leads to the Shea Rebellion. It was potentially become a coup, but it happens in 1787 in January, when Daniel Shea led 1,200 men to seize control of a federal arsenal. They held it to protest the state's inability, the state of Massachusetts' inability to address the problem of debt for small farmers. So, the failure of the Articles of Confederation then, as we've already mentioned, the American states began to levy their own tariffs to raise money. So this led to a lot of competition between the states. The federal government's inability to get any help from the states for paying off the debt further created problems. And the states are competing with each other. And so this leads some people to believe we need some kind of a federal government to regulate some of these things. So this is going to lead to a constitutional convention. This is an effort to amend the Articles of Confederation. That's the way it first started. But it became clear that just amending the Articles of Confederation probably wasn't going to work, so it actually became a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. The meetings were held in secret, and this allowed each member to speak their mind about, without, people back home or others giving them a hard time. The membership of the Constitutional Convention unanimously agreed that George Washington should be the president of the convention because of his leadership during the Revolutionary War. Members were elected by their state. However, most of them are elites. I mean, they are wealthy, elite background. So the preliminary plan, one's called the Virginia Plan, one's called the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan sought to just scrap the Articles of Confederation, create a Congress with two houses. The New Jersey Plan wanted to revise the Articles of Confederation rather than replacing them all together. So these are competing plans. A part of the problem is population in the South, certainly population of free citizens, was low. And so to get equal representation proportional to its population, this is what led the South to want to be able to count their slaves into their population. They wanted slavery to be legal, and of course the Northerners resisted this. Eventually, the 3/5 clause is adopted. This allowed those in the South, the southern states, to include 3/5 of their slave population for representation and for the apportionment of federal taxes. So you have to remember, in the South, of course, they did have a great number of slaves, and their other population is lower. So this is an attempt by them to gain a little more control and also a little more of the pie. The Constitutional Convention is also going to grant to the Congress the power to admit new states to the nation, because this is something, we don't really think about it now that much. But at that time, of course, there was a lot of territory out there in what they called the West that had not been really settled. It was sort of frontier, and that eventually would want to be settled. So how is that going to be handled? Well, they said the Congress will have the power to admit new states. So since eastern states were already a part of the nation, they were then given the power to regulate the number of new western states that could enter. Okay. So you can already see built into this the tension between what we'll come to call slave states and free states, even in the beginnings of the Constitution. So what powers did the Congress end up getting? The Congress was given the power to collect taxes, to create revenue. They were given the power to regulate domestic and foreign commerce. The Congress could declare war. Congress could maintain an army. The Congress could make necessary and proper changes to pursue the powers given to them. That's, for example, if you're going to collect taxes and increase revenue, then that may involve creating some sort of agency or some sort of procedure in order to do that, for example. Okay? It also created an executive branch. So you have the Congress, that's the legislative. Now the executive branch. This is the president. So there's going to be a president, and the president's going to have a cabinet. How do we determine who the president is? The president will be elected by the Electoral College. The Electoral College was set up in order to assure that we got a qualified candidates got elected as president. And we still have the Electoral College today. The Electoral College today. Some people want to get rid of it. Personally, I think there is some benefit to it, but I don't have time to go into that right now. So I'm not really in favor of getting rid of it myself. It assures that we have much more chance that we're going to have someone who is elected with a majority of the electoral votes, and it assures that we have it helps to ensure that we don't have the fragmentation we might have without it. I'll just leave it at that. Powers given to the president by the Constitution, El Presidente as I call him, make treaties after approval by 2/3 of the Senate, oversee the Army and Navy as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to name diplomats with the consent of the Senate, and to execute the laws passed by the Congress. The President can also veto acts of Congress that are unconstitutional. So, these are still there. I think the power of veto, well, I don't know if it's always because they're unconstitutional. It might just be because the president doesn't agree. But certainly that's there. judicial branch. You know this one. The Constitution provides for a federal system of courts headed by a Supreme Court and regional federal courts and justices. So there we have the executive, the judicial, and of course the legislative branches. All right, so now, of course, one of the problems here, one of the debates is always between federal, and it still is today, between federal and state power. One of the things that the Constitution is going to do is make it illegal, make it forbidden for states to make their own currency. So there, you know, in Missouri, you can't come up with your own Missouri dollar, that sort of thing. Also, having customs, you know, like if a good comes into your state, you can levy a customs against it or a tariff. Or somehow nullifying contracts that have been made between individuals, maybe from different states. So the federal government could rule individuals directly, and they had the power of taxation. All right, so how does all of this get ratified? Conventioneers urge each state to hold a special convention to ratify the new Constitution. So it's going to go state by state. A few states ratify it right away. Well, some other states, especially those with large population, begin to generate opposition. They feel as though perhaps the large states are not getting enough representation. And so, as we said, people get divided between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were primarily the ones that framed the Constitution. And so that emphasized that the new government would not end state autonomy, but many of them openly campaigned for the Constitution's ratification. Federalists such as John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, I'm sure you know about him because of the musical, wrote the Federalist Papers to influence the debate in New York. Supporters of the Constitution then emphasized that the new government was designed around the principle of federalism. Of course, this did not sit that well with the Anti-Federalist. Federalism, as you can see written there, basically means that the states, the government, where the state and the nation share equal responsibility. The Anti-Federalists prefer a weaker confederation of states and more direct democracy rather than the federalism that we see in parts of this Constitutional Convention. So the Anti-Federalists insisted on the addition of a Federal Bill of Rights in the Constitution to ensure individual rights. The Federalists did not want any amendments, but there was a compromise, and eventually the Bill of Rights is passed. By June of 1788, New Hampshire voted to ratify the Constitution. That was important because it became the critical 9th state to put the Constitution into operation. So remember, if you have 13 states, sort of 7 put you over 50% by By the time you get up to 9 now, you've only got 4 that haven't passed it. So protecting the freedom of each individual from a threat of a potentially tyrannous federal government. The first 2 of the amendments of the Bill of Rights did not pass, but the remaining 10 became what we call today the Bill of Rights. And I'm glad they passed, personally. The final amendment pronounced that any power not delegated to the federal government was reserved for the states. This is also an important amendment to limit the sort of expansion of the federal government. Now, certainly what we have seen in the 20th century, and certainly now going into the 21st century, is that the federal government has greatly expanded, especially, let's say, in the last 100 years. So I don't see any way to put that toothpaste back in the tube or the genie back in the bottle or whatever kind of thing you're saying there. It's going to be very difficult to change that. The federal government has an immense amount of power today. Something that I'm sure those anti-federalists were worried about. So, 2 main issues relative to the power of the states and slavery. When we talk about equality, each state had equal power in the Articles of Confederation. Large states stressed equality of men, not states. So, in other words, they wanted to go by population, which you might imagine, for example, comparing Rhode Island to Pennsylvania or New York. Rhode Island's very small by comparison, yet if you don't go a sort of proportional thing by population, Rhode Island's going to have just as much say in everything as, say, New York. There's also concerns about the power of any new states. In other words, those western areas becoming states. The South feared that the North domination would lead these new states to be opposed to slavery, and therefore slavery would be outlawed. Okay. And so what we're going to see then is, since you see the Northwest Territory, all of that's going to be no slavery. So that's a lot of territory, potentially 3 to 5 states that could come in opposed to slavery. And so now the South is getting concerned, right? But eventually it leads to compromise. And we end up with, I think, as you should know, with a bicameral legislature. Bicameral, which means 2 houses, 2 bodies. So we have what might be called the lower house, or the House of Representatives, somewhat patterned upon Great Britain, that has the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Representatives then would be more like the House of Commons. The House of Representatives is based on population, and it still is today. So the number of representatives that a state has is based upon their population. There's some states that only have 1 representative in the House of Representatives. For example, Wyoming. There's only 1 in there. You take a state like California or Texas or Florida, large population, lot of seats in the House of Representatives. Now here's what happens when you have a census, as we had recently in 2020. Once the census information is out there, you actually see a shift in the House of Representatives. The shift has been, in recent years, say the past 30, 40 years, that people are moving south. And so you'll see, for example, Ohio losing seats in the House, and a place like North Carolina gaining seats in the House. That's simply based upon population. As a population declines in a state, they lose a seat in the House of Representatives, and that seat then shifts to wherever it has grown. But, of course, in the Senate, it's always fixed. There's only 2. But there's 2 for each state. So this means a place like Wyoming with very low population gets 2 senators and 1 House of Representatives. So they get 3 total. So that kind of balances it some to the state. So this is the compromise, right? Then, of course, for the South, the big part of the compromise is what we already mentioned, the 3/5 compromise, because if you're going to count population to determine how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives, the South wanted to make sure that you actually count the slaves into that population because they made up a significant percentage of the population in the South. So the compromise worked out is that they would be counted, as far as the population goes for the House of Representatives, as 3/5. Okay, 3/5. So this means the South would get more representatives in the House of Representatives, but not an equal number. So the state legislatures were to appoint the senators, and the federal judiciary was established with life terms. So this is the Supreme Court. Supreme Court justice serves for life. And that's the way it's been since the beginning. It's still that way today, although some people kind of grumbling they want to change it. But that's the way it's been. So when a justice dies, then you can add a new justice, and they will serve. So if they're typically, they don't become a justice usually till they're in their 50s, sometimes in their late 40s. And if somebody is, say, 52 years old when they become a justice, they might be a justice for 40 years if they live to be 92. Now, a justice can decide to step down if they feel physically or whatever they need to. That's certainly allowed. But you can't force them out. It's a life position. National executive, that is the president, is given the veto power, as we mentioned. Power to regulate interstate and international trade is also going to the federal government. And to avoid objections from the states, there will be special state conventions to vote on this convention, on this Constitution. So the final product, most influenced by Madison's Virginia plan, and the debate over finer points continue. May to September. 39 of the 55 delegates signed on and approved. So you can do the math on that. That is a majority. And then it's sent to the states for debate and ratification. 9 states are needed to ratify. And so you see, once you hit that 9, then you have it. Well, concerns still in place were the powers of taxation, civil liberties. There was no Bill of Rights yet, so that's going to be put into place. The scale of representation in the House, how many individuals, how are you going to proportion that? So how many people do you need in a state to get one representative? So they come up finally with the plan, no more than one representative for every 30,000 people. Many are convinced that a Republican government could not endure in a large territory. That was a belief outside the U.S. and in. Well, the Federalist Papers we mentioned earlier. Here you see the front plate of the Federalist Papers. They were anonymous essays arguing for ratification, but in fact they were written by three individuals: James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. And they basically set out a defense of the Constitution and the provisions therein. These were actually published in newspapers in New York from the fall of 1787 to the spring of 1788. And so most people consider these to be classic works of the American political science, political scene. Well, as here you see a map showing votes at the district level for ratification by the state constitution. Delegates supporting it, delegates opposing it, districts that are evenly divided. So you can see there was a lot of debate over this, and but it pushed through in Pennsylvania in December of 1787. Small, less populous states ratified it quickly because it gave them, actually, they were afraid that they would have less power, so they decided, we're going to go for this. 5 states had ratified by 1788. Massachusetts convention, uncertain at first, but narrowly approved in February. So there you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there was a lot of opposition in Virginia, but it eventually passed in their state government, 89 to 79, so pretty evenly divided. New York followed soon after a big push by Hamilton, and then many states ratified with recommendations for amendments. North Carolina and Rhode Island were slow to ratify. Okay, so that's what brings then these amendments, which will become the Bill of Rights. They're condensed from 12 down to 10 into the Bill of Rights by James Madison. They were influenced by what was going on in the state conventions and what was in legal documents of England. 17 amendments passed by the House, 12 by the Senate. The states only ratified 10. The process was completed in 1791. Okay, so this is a quick overview, really. The last 2 lectures have been a quick overview of the bringing about of the Constitution and of the sort of transition of this early republic. Well, I hope you have a good day, and take care. We're going to end it right there.